Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Despite pledges of more military assistance to fight Russia, NATO leaders are still indecisive about how and when Ukraine would join the alliance, a result which Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has labeled absurd. Meanwhile, China has strongly rejected NATO leaders labeling China a systemic challenge to Euro-Atlantic security as alliance leaders meet for a two-day summit in the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. How divided is NATO over Ukrainian membership? How will European security look like as the military organization continues to enlarge? And why is NATO potential expansion in Asia so strongly opposed? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by Peter Kuznick, Professor of History at American University, Andrew Korybko, Moscow-based American political analyst, and Professor Ulrich Bruckner at Stanford University in Berlin, and later by Wang Jian, Associate Professor at Northwest University of China. That's off topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. So first, let's start with this enlargement, obviously with Denmark and Sweden. In particular, at the last moment, Turkish President Erdogan made this surprising move of reversing its decision, the year-long opposition to Sweden joining the NATO alliance, but tied Turkey's approval directly to the European Union, approving Turkey's membership into the bloc. So we'll start with Peter here. How have NATO leaders responded to this position? How likely the EU will agree to this, let's say, condition of Sweden joining NATO?
Well, Erdogan, as you say, after a year of opposition to Sweden's joining, has really bent. But Sweden made a lot of concessions also. So Erdogan has been given assurances that he will get F-16 fighter jets from the United States. It still has to go through Congress. He has been given indications that the path to EU membership is now open. That's very important because Turkey's economy has not been doing well. He's back in the fold on a much friendlier basis with the other NATO countries, because for the past year, he's been sidling up to Putin quite a bit. And so they have not been sure whether he is really aligned with NATO or is much more sympathetic to the Russian position. But he seems to have made his bed now with NATO. Sweden, on the other hand, has effectively changed its constitution. Sweden has passed new anti-terrorism laws. Sweden has bent over backward to really give in to many of Erdogan's demands. So this is significant to have Sweden, because Sweden has a long history of being a neutral country. In fact, there wasn't a good history during World War II when they remained neutral in the face of Nazi Germany. And they've tried to wipe that stain off their history. But now they're siding with NATO. Now they're becoming part of NATO. They've got a strong navy, and they bolster NATO's northern flank. So this is an important development.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, some commentators have pointed out, with this membership of Sweden inside NATO, the Baltic Sea could become a lake of NATO countries. So what does that mean to Russia in particular about national security here?
Okay, I believe that the Baltic Sea has pretty much always been a NATO lake since the end of the Cold War. The reason that I have this assessment, despite Finland and Sweden not having been members of the bloc up until just recently, and Sweden has yet to be formally approved, is because those two countries have been very closely aligned with NATO since the end of the Cold War. I mean, they've been training together, their militaries have been brought up to their standards, they have transit agreements, they've been selling arms to one another. So for all intents and purposes, although they were officially neutral, I mean, I personally regard them as shadow or informal members of NATO. Now, in terms of the larger geo-military consequences of them formally joining, I don't think it's going to change much in terms of Baltic Sea geopolitics or the military situation. Rather, I argue that this is mostly symbolic. Because if we look at NATO membership, to briefly just describe what it means, I mean, this is a group of countries that coordinate their military policy, sell arms to one another, and train. And yes, Article 5 does imply, it does mandate mutual defense obligations, but this is limited by what each member deems necessary. I mean, the actual language is as deems necessary. It could be armed force, but it doesn't have to be. So I think if we look at the situation as it's existed since about the mid-1990s, early 2000s onwards, I don't really think much has changed, to be quite honest. So I think that all told, on balance, I mean, Russia has been on the defensive in that part of Europe for quite a while already and will remain so. Will it change the larger military balance between Russia and NATO? Personally, I don't think so, but I do acknowledge that some people feel differently.
Okay, some people feel differently. With the enlarged NATO, Andrew, does that mean, European countries in particular, they say, okay, now we are secure because, obviously NATO is much larger, stronger, and with much longer distance, along with the Russian borders. So in that sense, they say, there's probably, in their words, no fear of Russia.
I think it depends upon how you assess the threat that each side poses to the other. I mean, the way that Russia sees it is that it has never really posed a credible threat to Finland or Sweden. It had no intent to do so. So the idea that Finland and Sweden were threatened by Russia in any conventional sense, I personally don't believe that holds up to scrutiny. However, from the opposite side, I do believe that there is a chance, of course, of NATO personnel, weapons. It depends upon what type of weapons, of course, could be deployed to Finland, and that would, of course, complicate Russia's defensive strategy. But I do believe that the Russian General Staff has prepared accordingly and will respond reciprocally as needed. Personally, I don't foresee any crisis. I do think, however, that in terms of symbolism, this ropes in the rest of the Arctic Council into NATO for the most part, because now we see that they're all pretty much on one page and there is no ambiguity about that. So I think the Arctic Council is really going to be mostly adversely affected by this development, more so than Russia's conventional security interest.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Bruckner, now, in return for the EU membership, basically, Turkey has made a turnabout and agreeing to Sweden's NATO membership. So what are the, let's look at the future, what's the likelihood that Turkey will become an EU member at any point in the near future? Professor Bruckner.
Well, on the one hand, both NATO and the European Union are Western organizations. Both are Western organizations, and Turkey is even longer a NATO member than Germany is, and is a candidate country for EU membership. But the two organizations, although they are based in Brussels, and although they have a similar goal to protect Western values, have nothing to do with each other. So a lot of people were surprised that Erdogan brings up the idea that he is on a horse trading and offers the support for Swedish membership in return for opening negotiations with the European Union. The EU sent a constructive signal, but Turkey has moved since 2005 so far away from what the requirements for EU membership are that there is no chance to see Turkey becoming an EU member anytime soon. It also takes two to tango. Turkey needs to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria, and the EU should be able and ready to accept a large country like Turkey that is so different and surrounded by regional conflicts and on a different trip when we look at the requirements for EU membership, that this is not in any foreseeable future a realistic scenario.
Mm-hmm. Probably little possibility of Turkish EU membership anytime soon. Let's turn to, of course, following this enlargement of NATO, this military alliance. Peter, of course, one of the biggest item on the agenda is the Ukraine membership, whether or not. Obviously, we see that there's no invitation to join NATO with a clear time frame either. So what do you make of that? It seems like different countries have different opinions. Some of the eastern flank countries, they are preferring immediate, as quick as possible, Ukraine membership, but the U.S. and some other countries are opposed to that?
I'm not in the habit of praising Joseph Biden's foreign policy, but he did make a wise decision here. He understood something that the Eastern Europeans and the Baltic states and some of the others do not quite understand, that bringing Ukraine into NATO now greatly increases the chances of World War III. From the beginning, Biden has been willing to provide almost unlimited amounts of arms and aid to Ukraine, but he drew a line. And he said that the United States will not engage Russia militarily directly. We will not precipitate World War III. We will not get involved ever in a nuclear war over this. Zelensky was very angry. He issued a statement saying this is unprecedented and absurd, the fact that there was no explicit timeline given. The Ukrainians were furious, and the Americans, in response, were furious with Zelensky for this kind of open criticism and seeming ingratitude. The United States was to provide the bulk of the arms, the bulk of the aid, the bulk of the support, has provided $47 billion the first year in military aid, over $100 billion overall, sees Zelensky partly as very ungrateful. So there is a real tension there. The Eastern Europeans, many of them don't share that view of the United States, but the United States, to some extent France, to some extent Germany, have dug in their heels and said that that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO now. And in fact, they're not that far from where they were in 2008, when George W. Bush first opened that door. They have some more guarantees. They don't have to go through the membership action plan. They got other commitments on military and other aid, but they did not get what Zelensky came there demanding, and that was immediate NATO membership.
Mm-hmm. Professor Bruckner, in what way this lack of, quick membership probably for Ukraine will impact this performance on the battlefields with Russia?
Well, it's understandable from Zelensky's point of view that he's asking for a strong signal that would lift the morale of the soldiers who fight for the liberation of Ukraine. So symbolically and as an act of we belong to the West, it's only a matter of time and we have a clear timeline, it would help a lot. But he can be angry, and there could be something like a rhetorical conflict between President Biden and President Zelensky, but both Biden and Zelensky know what the story is and who is in what kind of position. It's just an expression of weakness on Zelensky's side that he's showing a lack of gratitude, but Biden understands why this is happening. I think it's not so much about avoiding a World War III, but it is to have one option left on the negotiation table once the war comes to an end and a diplomatic solution should be reached, that there is still a chance to find a solution without a Ukraine membership that saves the face of Russia. If Russia's most concern was we are threatened by the West through Ukraine and therefore we need security guarantees, if this turns into something like a Swiss model for Ukraine, it's not officially ruled out by a promise of NATO to get Ukraine in. Whether this is a realistic option or whether it's just a bargain chip in the upcoming negotiations, nobody knows. Mm-hmm. But that, I guess, is also one of the reasons why it wasn't sent as a strong commitment that Zelensky wanted. Mm-hmm.
Well, Andrew, from the Russian point of view, some countries are talking about, at the end of the war. Of course, we don't know when the war will end. Ukraine will become a NATO member. They say only NATO membership will secure, will make sure that there's a security for the Europeans and for Ukraine. Is a NATO membership for Ukraine acceptable in any sense for Russia?
I think it's absolutely unacceptable, but at the same time, Russia needs to understand, as I think all observers should, is that Ukraine is, for most intents and purposes, largely integrated into the bloc as it is. I mean, this proxy conflict between Russia and NATO that's been raging in Ukraine has really brought Ukraine's military forces up to NATO standards a lot faster than any other aspiring member had previously done in history. But having said that, to go back to NATO membership, what really is the defining point? I mean, if we look at the fact that right now Ukraine coordinates its military policy with NATO, okay, NATO members do that. It has NATO training, NATO arms, okay. Well, the only thing missing is Article 5. But I read an interesting article from a Foreign Affairs magazine, the official magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations, and they were critical of Ukraine's NATO membership, and they cited an opinion from those that want it, who said, well, hey, if you look at Article 5, it says provide support as each member state deems necessary. That could already be interpreted as Ukraine already kind of receiving some Article 5 guarantees. I think the difference between formal membership and informal membership is this. Countries that are formal NATO members have the expectation that Article 5 will mean armed force in their support, whereas countries that are not yet formally part of NATO and might never be, such as Ukraine, do not have that expectation. This is globally significant because if there were to be another conflict between Russia and Ukraine, in such a scenario where Ukraine is a NATO member, Russia might believe that whether it has to act preemptively to defend its own interest or respond to an attack from a NATO member Ukraine, that it might as well just attack all of NATO because there's a very credible chance that NATO would respond with armed force in that scenario. But by keeping Ukraine out of NATO, comparatively speaking, you are able to manage a conflict between Russia and NATO in Ukraine by proxy, as we have to an extent quite impressively so far over the past 17 months. So I believe that both sides, Russia's and NATO's interests, are served by keeping Ukraine out of NATO and not having any expectation that armed force would be called upon in the event of another Russian-Ukrainian conflict, which could, in that sense, push Russia to want to attack NATO directly in order to preempt what they expect NATO would be launching against it. So basically, in scientific terms, it's all about managing a security dilemma, and that's why I believe it is unacceptable for Ukraine to be a member of NATO, because the security dilemma could very easily spiral out of control.
To manage this dilemma of security. Now we have Professor Wang Jin from Northwest University in China. Wang Jin, welcome to the show. Of course, if you look at the communique or the final statement of the NATO organization, for several points, more than a dozen points, they mentioned China, presenting China as a challenge to NATO's interests, security, and values, and accusing China of basically violating this rules-based international order in the South China Sea. What do you make of that?
I think it is a kind of a continuation of the transformation of NATO's strategy, because if we know that in the last year, the summit of NATO also emphasized that China is so-called the challenge, while called Russia the so-called threat. To some extent, I think some NATO memberships, they hope to link China with Russia together and also try to describe and try to construct the world that is threatened or challenged by China and Russia and other some kind of the states that are perceived negatively by the NATO memberships. But what I wanted to say that here, this is very ridiculous. This is very absurd. Because China, on the one hand, has already been trying to maintain the very positive ties with every NATO member states, and in front of every dimension, for example, from the political trust, from the military connections, from the economic cooperation, and even from cultural exchanges. So that is very ridiculous that to define China as on the one hand, as a so-called challenge, and on the other hand, maintain so many cooperations with China. And on the other hand, we have to know that to define the other states in the public as a kind of threat or the challenge, I think it is very ridiculous that somebody define themselves as the very, very safe keeper or very, very security keeper when they trying to define other states, just on their own understanding, based upon their own understanding, just based upon their own willingness. For example, that if we look at some of the NATO membership, it was them who invaded and violated the international law and invaded the other nations, but based upon their own understanding, their own national interests, without respect of the NATO United Nations, without the consideration of the international society's willingness and attitudes. So how China could be considered as kind of the challenge to the so-called values, so-called the unity of the NATO countries. So I think it is very, very ridiculous. I think in the future, maybe more cooperations and the communications, especially communications and dialogue, should be organized between China and the NATO countries to try to melt down and manage this kind of the distrust between the two sides. And also, it should be that for the NATO countries to manage their own behaviors that might lead to the provocation and the other crisis between the China and some NATO membership states in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, like in the time running up to this NATO summit, there was talk of a NATO branch in Tokyo, Japan, not far away from China. Everybody understands that's targeting China. That's the expansion of NATO. What's the justification for NATO to expand beyond its geographic limitation to Asia? I mean, we know, of course, people don't necessarily agree with each other on the NATO's role or what kind of a role NATO played in the Ukraine war. But obviously, NATO expansion to Asia will be strongly opposed by China. And of course, there's also concern from ASEAN countries about their centrality, which will be affected by NATO expansion here.
Yeah, the last I looked, Japan was not part of the North Atlantic. So this North Atlantic Treaty Organization has been very expansive in recent years. They've been involved in Afghanistan and many other places militarily. But you have to understand NATO as an arm of U.S. foreign policy. As Macron had said a few years ago, NATO was brain dead. It was looking for a mission. Biden came to office delivering that mission, especially with the help of Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. Now NATO wants to expand to Asia. And it says that China poses a threat to NATO's interests, security, and values. And so it's talking about opening this liaison office in Tokyo. However, if you look at the new communique, it's not happening because there's a division within NATO. Many of the European countries, especially what Rumsfeld would have called old Europe, especially France and Germany, don't see China as the threat that the United States does. Do not want trade war with China, want cooperation with China. And so since NATO operates on the basis of unanimous opinion, they were able to, temporarily at least, block the much more aggressive U.S. stance toward China. I think that's very positive right now. But this is the way Stoltenberg and other European leaders see the future. They see NATO's future after they take care of Ukraine, which they're optimistic about, despite the fact that Ukraine is not doing very well and is counteroffensive. But after that, then they see the NATO moving toward Asia, which would be, in my opinion, a very, very bad mistake.
Well, Peter, you mentioned about the long-term strategy probably. The former Secretary General of NATO, Rasmussen, not long ago, he talked about, now is the time to have a, stable and powerful Ukraine, and so we can, quote unquote, fix Russia, and then we can free up our resources, and then we can address the real long-term challenge, China. It sounds like a Cold War.
Right, that's the way the Americans see it. Russia is the immediate issue because of the invasion of Ukraine, but China is the long-term threat to American hegemony, right now in the Pacific, but globally as well. And that's an unfortunate view, but we see that there are 4 Asian countries participating in this summit. So you've got Japan, you've got South Korea, you've got Australia, and you've got New Zealand. And they're referring to them as the Indo-Pacific 4. They also participated last time. So the United States, part of its policy of militarization of the Pacific is trying to draw these allies closer and closer politically, diplomatically, and militarily. We see that also with Japan doubling its military spending, South Korea's very, very aggressive policies, 4 new bases in the Philippines, other aspects of American expansion in the region. China is the real threat, the way the American policymakers see it. The Rand Corporation came up with a report that said avoiding a long war in Ukraine. Why? Because they said the real focus should be China. So let's get this Ukraine thing figured out sooner rather than later so we can focus on our real challenge, and that's stopping China.
Professor Bruckner, here, of course, the no mention of this liaison office in Tokyo was partly seen as the result of the strong opposition from some NATO members, in particular European countries, and here France standing out, expressing opposition to this move. So what's the general view of European countries, in particular, let's say, old European countries? China does not see like Germany or France as a threat. Is far away from each other. How can China be a challenge? And how can countries justify the expansion to Asia of NATO?
Well, as united as the West is when it comes to Ukraine, there are very different threat perceptions when it comes to China. And Germany and France are massively invested in China, and they would rather want to continue with this mutual, fruitful form of trading partners and investing partners, and China as a provider of rare earth and a lot of materials that Europe is dependent on. So on the one hand, the lesson learned from Russia for the Europeans is don't be naive, don't take something for granted. Just because China talks of a peaceful rise, it will always be like this, because the theater in the Pacific looks more like a confrontational one between the United States and China, and Europe is asked by the biggest NATO partner that was just described as US foreign policy is executed through NATO to take sides. So this is something Germany and France aren't ready yet to take sides to an extent that this variety of describing China as a competitor, a partner, a potential rival, to take a position. Germany was reluctant to formulate a Chinese position, and the European Union is also struggling with taking a clear position to either support the United States or to formulate something like strategic autonomy. So this is a hot potato, and nobody really knows in what direction this is really moving. But the balance of power between Europe and America changed with the war in Ukraine, because America is taking the largest contribution to Ukraine, and Europe owes something to the United States, and the United States will ask Europe to pay their dues in the Pacific when it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Briefly, Andrew, the former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating said, quote, exporting that malicious poison to Asia, meaning NATO expansion, would be like Asia welcoming the plague. 30 seconds, what's your take?
I believe that NATO is already expanding to the Asia Pacific for the reason that the other guests have spoken about. Also, we have AUKUS. AUKUS is intended to serve as the core of an Asia Pacific NATO. It is expanding informally to Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and also the Philippines. I'm very pessimistic about regional security in the future because the United States is saber rattling and it's very, very dangerous.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to all of our guests. With that, we come to the end of today's show. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.